to have you with us and also people online. Today we are very honored to have what I call a giant in printmaking art and research, Mr. Professor Stephen Hoskins to be with us. Today he will talk, first of all, introduce some of his work, art, science, technology, research and all that. And then we'll open up the floor and then we have Q&A and discussion of all that. So without further ado, Mr. Stephen Hoskins.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for Hong Kong Print Shop for inviting me to talk this afternoon. I have divided the talk mainly up into three sections, and the first section is how I sort of got there, which we've taught the art. The second section is much more about my background in technology through running a research centre, and then the third section is about being an academic, which is something I'd never thought I'd be, but we'll explain. So if we could go the next slides, actually we could go through two, please. I'll start talking as I know what the first slide is. In the 1970s, a long time ago now, I was between my first and second degree. I first of all studied printmaking for 3 years as an undergraduate and then moved on to the Royal College of Art. Can we go to the next one? And in that period, before I went to the Royal College of Art, I couldn't make art. I didn't have a studio. I got terribly interested in kites and started making kites, and two books really informed me. One was this guy called David Pelham, the book on kites, and it was the best how to do it book that you could possibly get hold of that came out in the 70s. And the other was The Art of the Japanese Kite by Tal Streeter. Now the thing about The Art of the Japanese Kite is Streeter, and sadly I never met him and I should have done, was also an artist and made kites that were called flying red lines, which were quite famous in the 70s, and you can still see some of his sculpture in Central Park in New York. But he spent a long time in Japan studying the master kite makers, and I suddenly realized that you could combine kite making with art. And the print in the middle, which is in the show here, was one of the first kites I made. One of tradition in England, you make a diamond-shaped kite and you fly it, and that's it. This was a W-form kite which came in and out, and suddenly there were new shapes and new things you could do. So I started making a series of work related to kites, and if we can move to the next slide. Just before I show you some of the kites I made, I had a bit of an epiphany at one point. I was making work separate to the kites, which were based on mathematics and harmonic division. So either the golden section, which is 1 to 1.614, or Alberti's theories of harmonic proportion, where 6 is 2/3 of 9 and 4 is 2/3 of 6. So I was making things at 4, 6, and got very constrained. And then suddenly I was asked to take part in a show at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And we were looking at work based on 18th century silverware. And I found a toast rack for putting your toast in, a silver toast rack. So I thought I'd make a kite of a toast rack. And so here's my 18th century toast rack kite.
And it flies?
It flew. It flew perfectly well. But there is a bit of an extension to the story because it was too big to go into a showcase for part of the exhibition at the Victoria and Albert. Now, you know, this is a light wooden glass fibre and tissue. It probably weighs, I don't know whether you think in pounds or kilograms here, a couple of pounds, a kilogram at most. So we thought we could hang it from the ceiling. The V&A decided it was far too dangerous to hang from the ceiling because it might fall down and hurt somebody. So sadly, though it was in the catalogue, it never got shown. It ended up in a cupboard at the Victoria and Albert Museum, which for a kite seems a rather sad life. But it was a piece, and I often describe work as work on the way to somewhere else. As an artist, I tend to make work in series. You start and you develop, and you go down a path, and then you think, I've had enough now. And usually when you get to the end of that's the bit everybody likes because you've got used to doing it. And
you jump the steps.
Yeah, you jump up the steps and you've done that and you think it's time to go somewhere. So you make a new bit, which is usually pretty rubbish, but it's a bit that's on the way.
Interesting.
Yeah, to the next thing. So this was a piece of work on the way to somewhere else. So in itself, I don't think it was a great piece of work. It was amusing, it was great fun, but it wasn't in itself a great piece of work. So can we have the next slide? So I started making these, and these are commonly known as the ears, because they were bits from Freedom. I just made, if you take a long glass fibre rod and fold it in half, and then you can bend it, you end up with this ear shape at the top. So the rod can, if you bend it back on itself, you get this loop. And then, so I made a series of these. And then if we go to the next one, and also at the time, there was a big movement in England, which is less now, but craft was a dirty word. In fine art circles, and I was trained as a fine artist, making stuff and having skill was just not seen as being something that was a good thing. It was all about, it wasn't artistic. Yeah, the concept was everything. Yeah. So I thought I'd make a series of work that had lots of craft skills in to show in the gallery. So these are based on kites from Hamamatsu in Japan, where they traditionally make fighting kites. And there are about 90 knots on the back. Yeah, but I also wanted to use modern materials. So I used glass fibre rod and a particular form of thread called dacron, which is covered in wax, which actually you can no longer get. But the beautiful thing about it is you can tie a knot and it stays, which is actually...
Is that bookbinding kind of...
It's a bit like bookbinding thread, but it's waxed. Okay. And it's a sort of nylon thread, but it's not slippery.
Right.
So you can tie really tight knots with it.
I have one question.
Do.
Here. When you do kites, do you have to take care of the wind flow and the aerodynamics and all those sort of things? Because
yeah, they have to be...
All of your kites can fly,
yes.
right?
They, theoretically, they can all fly. They don't all fly, because if they get grubby and dirty, you can't sell them. So.
Okay. So all your kind of kites you make, you try to put it in the air and
some,
test them?
Not all of them, but intentionally they will fly. So this is a standard Hamamatsu shape. It's not particularly asymmetric, even though it's got a small hole in the middle. If I'd put big holes in one side, then it would wobble all over the sky.
Oh, right, okay.
But this would fly. Yeah, in the past I've been asked by a kite maker who worked at the Aeronautical Institute. And he said, do your kites fly? And I said, yeah. He said, what do you do? I said, just throw them up in the air and they fly. He said, oh, mine never fly. So, but yes, they would and they do.
Yeah.
But in a sense, with these, it was a balance of, with handmade paper, you can roll them around the edge.
Yeah.
So
my follow-up question is, your priority is on the flying or on the pattern or the structure or the craft?
No, the craft skills. In this particular context, my priority was to sneak craft skills into the art environment.
Try to irritate someone?
Yeah, just to be annoying.
Yeah, okay.
I've always had this thing that if I'm not in trouble, I'm not doing things properly. So yeah. So yeah, it was, and somehow it's just that, it's satisfaction, isn't it? Of with handmade paper, if you can roll it round an edge and glue it, and it stays, and I can stretch it, and it holds the structure together. So if we go to the next one, and then I started to bring the golden section back again.
Okay.
So these are all golden section kites. The proportion is completely part of the mathematical golden section. So this is still early on. This is maybe 1990s. And these do fly. These fly really easily, and they don't need a tail or anything, they do fly. But I also had this thing that I put strings on kites that go into frames, and if they weren't in frames, they didn't have strings on. So, just to be difficult. Because sometimes I haven't got any here, I was making a series of kites that had huge, if you make a kite called an Edo, which is a Japanese, it has about 40 lines to support it, bridle lines to fly it. And there are particular ways of tying them and knotting them. So some of the work was about the tying and the knotting. But we'll carry on, we'll go through the next two or three. This was one of the first digital prints I made. We had bought a NovaJet inkjet printer in, I suppose, about 1995, which is early on for big wide format printing. It was a pain in the neck, it made a mess everywhere, it kept going wrong, but it was a big wide format. And of course, I wanted to put Japanese paper through it just to see what would happen, so that would gum it all up as well. but we learnt a lot, and yeah, this is an early, so it has faded quite a lot. I have to say the early ink was pretty dreadful, but yeah. Next one. And these are two prints, to me these prints relate to the kites. Even though, so they're folded paper, they're screen printed, and this one's called Loons, Tunes and Wallpaper, because in the 1970s I had a bedroom painted bright orange with this sort of, I'm sorry to say, this is very 1970s, but I kind of like that reminiscent of going back and also folding, but this is hand cut, this one, with a carbon fibre rod. If we go to the next one, this currently is a derivation of the wallpaper in my front room at home, which is based on an 18th century wallpaper from Stockholm. But again, I just like that folded, delicate paper, so though these are recent, they have a history which relates to the kite. Okay, if we go to the next one. And this again is a work on the way to somewhere else. I thought I'd finish this section. I made this a couple of years ago, and this is based on some of the theories of Buckminster Fuller, who was an American architect who, I don't know if you've ever seen the geodesic domes, the big domes with rods. Fuller also had something he called tensegrity, where you could put rods in space and connect them with wires, but no rod would touch any other rod. And so this is based on the theories of tensegrity, and is a work that's a work on its own, and it's on the way to somewhere, but somehow I don't know yet where, but maybe it will be at a later stage. But I thought I'd put it in. So we're into the next stage. Right, so aeroplanes. This is, in my meanderings through the internet, as one does, I came across this article about this uncle of mine who at 17 made this model aeroplane called a Hoppet. Now, at 14, I used to make model aeroplanes, and you had a control line aeroplane. So you had a petrol engine in an aeroplane, and you had wires that came out of it, and you went round and round in a circle, a 70-foot wide circle, at high speed. He designed this thing in 1951, and it was called a stunt model. You can do loops and all sorts of things, and he won the prize for stunt, and then he put it into the speed competition, and won the speed competition at 92 miles an hour, and then proceeded to do stunts with it. So it was quite an amazing aeroplane, and I actually flew it in the 90s. But it got me thinking about the enjoyment for aeroplanes, and just those childish, I loved making model aeroplanes. So we'll move on. One more. So this was the first of the aeroplane pieces. This was a wing, and I made it, and as you sort of did, you put the roundels on it, because you were talking earlier about the kits you had when you were a child, and you had these plastic kits, and they were usually of warplanes, and they usually had, and I kind of think, roundels on, yeah, and then you think, I don't like warplanes. Why am I making things with warplanes? So I started putting roses on my prints. So if we go to the next one, I've put my studio in because I also think there are two things I want to talk about. One is that I started putting the wallpapers and patterns on. And two is, even though 90% of my job as a researcher is to do with high digital technology, and I'll explain more later, that I come from a background where I was taught to draw with a pencil and a piece of paper and a drawing board. So I wanted to show you my drawing board, which still occurs, and I still have my drawing board, and I love and adore my drawing board. But I think I'm terribly lucky to come from a generation that was pre-digital, but I have the advantages of the digital. And I'm trying to explain, if we move to the next slide, I make drawings by having a front elevation, a side elevation, and a plan, because that's how I was taught. And these are all combined in this drawing. So this is my drawing for a three-dimensional piece of work called Gull Wings, and it's incredibly accurate, and I laser cut all the parts from this drawing for the construction, but I didn't know what the construction was going to look like until I assembled it. So it's very important, but I could have just drawn this in CAD. I could have drawn this in a 3D program.
So you draw this?
I drew this, part of it I drew manually, and part of it I drew it in Illustrator, which is a flat 2D program.
Okay.
But I drew the three-dimensional structure in the 2D program, if that makes sense. And that's kind of weird, but it isn't if you come from my background. So I think I'm trying to get across that I like that interface between. One of my past students said to me, it's weird, he said, you use all this digital technology and then you use old craft skills to put it together. So you'll see in the next bit why. So this is the construction in 3 dimensions. Okay, so this is called Gull Wings. This has my wallpaper on. But I didn't know what it would look like until I slotted everything together.
Oh really? So you haven't seen it assembled before you drawn it?
I drew it, laser cut it on a laser cutter in plywood and balsa wood.
So it's all assembled?
And then assembled it. And until it was assembled, I didn't know what it was going to look like. And it just slotted together.
So how do you start with the idea of how did it take shape?
This is a story. Somebody was saying earlier about the model aeroplanes you had when you were a child. I built a model aeroplane that had wings that did this, called Gull Wings, okay, called a mini mower. And it's a famous, I spent 4 months making this. It's just over 2 meters because I could only do a meter width in the laser cutter.
I'm just wondering, it has to involve a lot of calculation because the ends have to meet and the curves have to meet from one way or the other.
If you draw it in, can we go back one? Sorry, folks. Can we go back a slide?
One back.
Back, 2 back. Back one.
Yeah.
It sort of involves a lot of calculation, but if you draw this in a plan, a front elevation and a side view, everything should fit together.
Okay.
Should. Didn't quite, but it
including the thicknesses of materials.
Yeah, because these parts here were actually the thickness of material.
Okay,
so the slots are the thickness of the material, so it slots together. But yeah, good question, sorry. It was, so yeah, can we carry on? Can we go forward again? And if we go forward once more, yeah, so you can see how it all slots together here. But yeah, it is pretty big and it's quite cumbersome. I originally thought that I could slot it together like a jigsaw and then show it and then take it apart again. But because it wasn't quite accurate enough, you put it all together and it springs apart. So it had to be glued and then it's difficult to move back. But that's a different story. Okay, we'll go on. Having made that, I've always had this obsession. I didn't want to make aeroplanes that were modern. So I thought I'd go back to before the Wright brothers. And there are 2 particular sets of people. One is a German gentleman called Otto Lilienthal, who made these gliders, these flying machines, that flew about 50 meters before they crashed. Eventually, poor man, of course, crashed, but we won't go into that. So I thought I'd make a large piece. It was originally I'd had a discussion with you about having a show for Impact when you did Impact. So if we move to the next slide. This was the piece. Now this piece, to give you a scale, this is 3.5 meters wide. This is big. This is a big piece of work.
So it's almost as big as this metal wall.
Almost as big as the metal wall. Yeah, certainly. Yeah, it's as big as this metal piece almost. Yeah, and it's screen printed. It's ink jet printed, it's laser cut, it's hand assembled, it's got 13-gram Japanese tissue behind it, and all the plywood feathers, for want of a better word, are all screen printed in 5 or 6 colours. And then the Cantonese on it, I think this one's, I made a Cantonese one and a Mandarin one, I think this one's Cantonese.
It's very hard to see.
It's hard to see. If we move forward, we go detail, we might go forward and back. Yeah, you can see.
Some Chinese.
I wanted to talk about my weekly life. As an English person, when you come to China, you often see, or I haven't seen it in Hong Kong, but in China you often see English things on T-shirts that make no sense whatsoever because they've been translated from Chinese into English and then confused, and they're just rubbish. So all these things are walking the dog, fish and chips, a pint of gold, which is the cider that I drink, yeah, and all that. And then they've been translated into Cantonese for me.
Okay.
And then they're printed on there. And I just, don't ask me why. I just thought it was a good idea. So, and then the bits printed on the feathers are based on a chinoiserie wallpaper from a place called Wootton Under Edge. And carrying the theme on, this wallpaper of birds was a copy of a Chinese wallpaper that was put into an English stately home. And then I've copied it and changed it and printed it onto, so it carries that whole thing through. And then it's all about model aeroplanes and wings and kites, and so, yeah. And I love it, and people really like it, but it's a pain to show because it's huge and it's really delicate.
You better not show in Hong Kong.
Sorry?
You better not ship it over here.
No. Yeah, I did want to ship it over here. It does all assemble.
Yeah.
And then, next slide, yeah, what do we go next? Yeah, do.
Do you show the actual plane and your drawings together?
Yes, because good question. If we go back, sorry, can we go back to?
One more.
One more, that's it. The drawing for this was made on brown paper, on packing paper, and it was drawn on my workbench, and then I assembled everything on the drawing. So I just drew it with rulers and assembled. And so the drawing's actually quite nice because it's covered in glue and gummy bits and extra bits of drawing and shopping lists. And it's huge, of course. So yes, yeah, the drawing does need to go with the...
The drawing's got this very nostalgic narrative.
Yeah.
To the way you know, is the way that you want people to look at your things is very specific.
Yeah.
It reminds me of art design actually in some ways.
Okay. Yeah.
There's some dreamy narrative about it, but when you see the actual photo of the plane,
yep.
It reminds me that it looks like an artifact.
Yes.
It has a very different.
Yeah, no,
I presume it's very different. That's why I was wondering if you show them together.
Yes, I did in this context, but actually for the gull wings, I haven't shown the drawing with the gull wings. But you're right. I think that I probably could and should. Because you're right, there is a narrative there, and you know, it's that mixture of hand drawing on brown paper, followed by technology to put the thing together. Because I couldn't put this thing together without digital technology.
You obviously doing the drawing like a process, right? The way you explain it, like there's glue on the drawings and etc. on the thing, but and then I imagine you see the actual object. Airplane was done.
Yeah. There is the conception is in the drawing. You're quite right, but the reality doesn't exist until the artifact is cut and assembled. We could go back to it, but obviously the other thing that's really interesting is on the process there are all sorts of parts and collective bits that have to be made before you can assemble the actual thing. So you make a kit of parts and then you have to put it together. So without the initial conception, I think you're right, I can't actually make the artifact, and I don't know what the artifact is until I get there, which is kind of, I don't think of it like that, but I think you're quite right. Yeah, thank you, that was good. Yeah, can we move on? No, it was great question. And again, so this is lockdown. And during lockdown, I couldn't get to the normal facilities I had. And there's this wonderful Frenchman called Clement Aidar who made a steam-powered aircraft.
Steam-powered?
Steam-powered, yep. It had a steam engine to power it, and it purportedly flew 20 metres, 20 centimetres off the ground. But obviously, you know, that's as far as it went. So I started making these, and they're very bat-like, and I'm afraid I couldn't, for this talk, find any Clement Aidar images to show you, because they're quite wonderful. They're like big bats. But I made these, and at the same time during lockdown, I was allowed to go for a walk every day for a mile or so, and I started collecting bird feathers, magpie feathers. So I started adding them to the, because what do you do during lockdown? You can't just go into the studio, you've got to kind of deal. So this is made from bits of everything else at the same time as bits that I collected. And I just thought I'd put them in because they were kind of fun, but I'm not sure about these. I think they've got a bit of a starkness that I think was to do with lockdown, that I don't know. But anyway, I think that's the end of this section, isn't it? Let's have a look. Yeah. So hopefully that's given you a brief overview of where I come from as an artist. Now we're going to talk a bit about my other life. So I run, or did run, a huge research centre. So if we carry on. The Centre for Fine Print Research, and to give you an introduction, we have always married technology and industry and commerce as an artist. My way of describing it was when I first got my first job as in this sort of area, in research, I thought to myself, very few people make it as an artist. And most of those who do make it as an artist and their work sells for large amounts are usually died. It's not till after they're dead does their work have any real value. Most artists struggle. And so I thought, well, I don't want to be a poor artist. So I'll do this. And if I can spend a third of my time making art, that's pretty good and get paid for it. So that was the basic premise. This, for instance, is our first 6-axis robot. And we had this whole thing of can we get it to draw calligraphically? But it wasn't about, lots of people make drawing robots. The whole point of this robot was when you write your signature, it's never the same. And our bit of research was how can you get the robot programmed so that it understands the tension in a paintbrush or the pressure of a pencil, and to write a signature that started and finished in the same place but didn't look identical. That's very easy to say. It's actually quite difficult to do, and flies contrary to a popular opinion in engineering. And we could talk about the accuracy of, most engineers want to measure things accurately, and they do all sorts of encoders and all sorts of things to measure accurately. And we were sort of saying, well, do you have to? So we had this project, and a lot of what we do is about questioning why you do something. So we'll carry on. This is the research centre in Bristol. It has, Ho Yin was asking me, it has traditional printmaking down one side. So it has etching, lithography, screen printing, letterpress. And then down the other side of the room are 16 different sorts of 3D printer.
16?
Yeah, 16 different sorts of 3D printer.
All different brands?
All different brands, all different types. There are 9 fundamental types of 3D printer that do different things. The one you usually see that extrudes plastic filament is just one sort. Yeah. There are all sorts of other types of 3D printer. We have laser cutters, we have plotters, we have wide format inkjet printers, we have 6-axis CNC machines, which means that not only, if you imagine a drill coming down, not only does the drill do this, but the piece where your work is held also does that. So that you can, we have 6-axis robots and cobots, we have a ceramics area, we have a ceramic 3D print area, we have photography, we have nanotechnology and graphene, and a traditional alternatives to print area, all within the one research centre. So there's 32 staff. So there's nothing really like it. I can honestly say there's nothing like it anywhere in the world.
Where does nanotechnology fit in?
Wearable graphenes.
Wearable graphics.
Wearable graphene, so wearable electronics that are printed. So printed wearable electronics we've been
Like
working.
the circuits and...
Yeah, like circuits and things that are actually in wearable garments. Okay, we'll go to the next one. But this is where we started.
Yeah.
I started out in 94 or whatever, researching into water-based ink for screen printing. By 2000, digital wide format technology had come along, and we joined a program from Hewlett-Packard called their Art and Philanthropy Fund. And Hewlett-Packard gave us big wide format printing machines, and because Hewlett-Packard gave us machines, Canon gave us machines, and because Canon gave us machines, Epson gave us machines, because Epson gave us machines, Roland gave us machines, so we ended up with everybody's wide format printers. And the first thing we did was tear them apart, because we had this thing that Hewlett-Packard said that they couldn't register a pixel across a meter. And so we went away for a day and came back and said, okay, we can do that now. And we filed a patent. And actually, what we did was we put a steel bar down one side, because they'd been trying to readjust the paper with crosses and optics. So we cut the paper, put a steel bar down one side, and put 2 pin register bits in. And so you could print it, and then you could pin it back down against the steel bar, as 99% of the rest of the print industry did. And it fits. So they went,
It's a bit like the peg bar.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You just put it on a peg bar. That's what the rest of the print industry does, but they didn't. So we could multiple layers. And at that time, we won't go into it, but we had theories that why did you print in CMYK? Cyan, magenta, yellow and black, the opposite of RGB in theory, but it isn't, is actually only a technology exists because you could only grind a ground glass screen in a particular way to get 4 colours without an interference structure. The computational guys took it up because it was easy, because 4 colours times 8 in each one, you know, the maths got to 2, 5, 6 colours quite quickly, and technology at that time didn't go any further. Now you get multiples of colour, and actually it's got even sillier, because they now they design more colours, and because they get interference structures, they then write algorithms for something called stochastic, which is to divide a grid up into random bits and create random technology. Whereas actually early inkjet printers produced a splatter. And if they'd refined the splatter, they wouldn't need the algorithms. And they could have had as many colours as they wanted. To cut the long story short, we started dealing with 19th century printing technology, things called collar type and Woodbury type, to prove to these people that you could have something called continuous tone and random structures, and
without using
computational maths, and also that you didn't need a black and a white, which they thought that actually the middle tones were far more important. If you look at a Victorian photograph, it doesn't have a black and it doesn't have a white, but they're still beautiful. And so it was a way of explaining to industry that they were doing it wrong, but proving to them. So if we carry on, sorry. At the same time, because we had all the kit, we could work for artists. So we started doing work for Richard Hamilton, famous. So we think the print on the right was probably the first £1 million, multi-million-dollar inkjet print. It went to the National Gallery in London, not the National Gallery, the Tate in London, Philadelphia, the Museum of Modern Art in New York was an edition of 3. And we had a special canvas made by Hewlett-Packard. They made us 2 football pitches worth of canvas just to print this print. So yeah, at the same time, and also we could experiment with somebody like Richard Hamilton. You can afford to spend the time when it's worth a couple of million.
Yeah.
You can spend a few months on getting it right, you know, and at the same time proving to other people that the technology worked. And this is an American artist called Leslie Dill. We did quite a lot of work in early days of LED, so that when you walked up to this, it lit up, and when you walked away, it didn't. But yeah, that was kind of fun. So this was the fun side compared to the technology and industry side. So if we carry on. Is this making sense?
Yeah, totally.
All right. 3D printed ceramics. Around 2007, I I won a government grant on the basis that I was the only department eligible for 1.6 million's worth of new lab equipment, but the university gave it to somebody else. So I threw all my toys out in the box and ended up with just over £1 million, which meant I could buy all this new 3D printing kit. Yeah. So my first 3D printer cost us £107,000, and it printed, it exposes a negative onto a photosensitive material, flashes it, exposes it, it drops a layer, it flashes it again, and it builds highly sophisticated stuff. Yeah, you can now buy the equivalent, a Chinese one, which is pretty good, for about £1,000. So 100th of the price. Things have changed rapidly over there, but at the time. And we were very interested in a powder printer that prints, you have a bin of powder and it inkjets, just inkjet ink on a layer, drops down, pushes over, inkjet. And actually what binds it all together is sugar, believe it or not. It's sugar and plaster. And you ended up with these artifacts. We thought, well, we could put clay in it. So we bought this machine and tipped clay in it, and my university said, oh, we've got a good deal, we've got a 3-year guarantee on it that only cost us £2,000. We broke that the first day. but of course it didn't work. We spent another couple of years working out that clay expands when you put water in it.
Yeah, of course, and it don't bind together.
It doesn't bind together. So the epiphany was to realise if we took clay that had been fired and ground it up, and it's called molokite, it's a standard thing, they throw it into pots, and then use the sugar, we could bind the pre-fired clay together and it didn't expand, and we could make pots.
Okay.
So, and then you could stick it back in the kiln and refire it, which is what we did.
Oh.
So we then filed a patent, and we have a patent on the 3D ceramic printing process, which is great. So, and then we did a lot. All in parallel to this, we're doing quite a lot of work with industry because we can talk to industry. And a lot of it's about the language you use. It's not, artists kind of have their own language, which doesn't necessarily relate to industry. And you know, I can wear a suit, I can put my suit and tie on, and you can go and talk to industry. But you have to use their language. The next bit across, the little hippopotamus, I was doing a residency in the Museum of Art and Design in New York, in Mad on the and we were giving a talk. I'd bought a pencil eraser in the museum shop of Metropolitan Museum at the airport of the hippo, and we scanned it, and then we printed one, because at the time we were working on something called self-glazing 3D printed ceramics. The idea that the earliest glazed material you could get, the Egyptians invented something called faience. And basically they put chemical salts in with the clay, and when it dries, the salts might government. This was a company called Burley. Now Burley are the last manufacturers of underglazed tissue printing, blue and white, willow pattern plates you've probably seen. Underglaze means you have the ceramic pot, you put your printed pattern onto the ceramic pot under the glaze, dip it in glaze and fire it. The plates, usually copper plates, hand engraved, okay, and then printed onto tissue and put on the pots. Now the problem was their youngest engraver was 76. And this factory employs 70 people. Prince Charles bought it as a heritage. He put his money in, or King Charles now put his money in. And to retain the jobs, they had to do something about the plate engraving because they couldn't. So we worked out that we could laser engrave the rollers that they printed, but they'd been trying to take the prints and then emulate, and they got fat lines and thin, and nothing like a hand engraved line. What we did was took a relief print of the surface of a roller, so you could see the width of line, and then worked out what the depth would be from the width digitally, all right, and then digitally laser engraved the roller, so that they can now make rollers in 3 days when it used to take them 6 months, and they can now train new. So this rescued the jobs of 70 people. So I'm not, part of me thinks we should still be hand engraving the rollers, but on the other hand, you've got to keep the company going. So, and there's 70 people's jobs at stake. So that's the sort of cross-industrial stuff that we do. If we move on. And we do a lot of that work. Currently, sorry, how are we doing? Are we all right? Currently I'm working with 3 companies at the moment. One's a rubber company, makes stretchy rubber, who wants to make print medical, what are called dental dams. So they want to print on a piece of rubber that goes into your mouth to see which tooth they should be working on or whatever. It sounds very easy. Actually, printing on rubber is really difficult. So we've actually worked out that you can laser onto rubber. Black rubber has titanium oxide in it, and if you laser it, it turns white. So we're lasering the rubber, and that's good because then there's no health problems from ink. So we then have another project that they want to screen print in colour because part of their business is about rubber fetish, fashion industry, and much more. I think that's kind of interesting. But yeah, so I'm working with a rubber company. I'm working on another company who produces screen printed ceramic transfer paper. I have a patent on transfer printing for ceramics, and we're redeveloping a paper for that because it's healthier. And I'm working on a company who stretches steel, but they stretch steel and other things until it breaks under stress tests, and they need to mark it in a particular way so that their machinery can measure how much it's stretched. So
before before it sort of breaks down.
Yeah, before it
so it's the tolerance of
it's a tolerance of how the steel or other material will stretch. So we're trying to work out a system of how we can print onto these things so that you can. So that's the sort of industrial work we still do. But also, I'm an academic. So okay, next.
So do they come to you, this industry?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Based on what?
Reputation, mainly.
Okay.
Word of mouth.
So how does your reputation go up across the artistic world and into the commercial? Or?
I think I have a bigger reputation in the industrial world than I do in the artistic world. Yeah, and let's put it into context. Hewlett-Packard used to call me an industry influencer. And they once said, and it never worked, and partially because we went down a different road, that they thought I might be able to rethink the future of photography. Now that's a big statement,
but
they believed that what we were doing was interesting enough that we might have taken a right turn.
All right.
They still didn't take a right turn because they wouldn't, but you know, yeah. So in the main, industry comes to us. Probably sometimes word of mouth, sometimes through government. Sometimes just people come to the university and ask for something, and yeah, it's usually reputationally based. It's taken us. But it's an interesting question.
Yeah. I mean, when you think of printmaking, it doesn't relate to steel and rubber and.
No, we had this discussion the other day, and I think we should explain it. I think you have to think of. I think of printmaking both as an artist, you saw my art, which is one segment of me over there, and then printmaking is also, they are industrial processes. You know, in 1760, you had to have an etching, and that's the way you communicated. You know, at 1870, I collect Alice in Wonderlands. All books that had illustrations were wood engravings, because that was the commercial process. What it means is that fundamentally I understand how a high-tech industrial printing company works. And I can think, well, they do that, but my Hewlett-Packard example is they're doing that, and they don't know what that bit of the print industry over there does, so I can pick that bit up and put it down into there. The fact that I'm an artist is pretty much usually irrelevant. I'm just a person that can solve their problems, is usually the way I'm conceived. And as I mean, my wife and I were laughing the other day. I've got 7 suits lined up in the wardrobe that I never wear anymore. But, you know, if I was talking to industry, I'd put a suit on. And that sounds obvious. It actually isn't. Most people don't do that. I used to be the only person everybody in the art school knew if I had industry coming in because I'd be wearing a suit. Nobody in the art school wears a suit. Well, they might wear a Paul Smith suit but that's not what industry used to. So, yeah, interesting question. But yeah, in the main, people come to us. Yeah, so my other hat in academic is, for a long time I was chair of the Association of European Historic Printing Museums. And my main job in the historic printing museums, I'll explain. This is the Bar-le-Papier Museum in Basel in Switzerland. The oldest working water-based paper mill left, still working in Europe. The top right is the Plantamoretus Museum in Antwerp. Yeah. Anybody who's been there would. Yeah, beautiful building. If you ever get the chance, best printing museum you ever want to go to. And the bottom is the Leipzig, used to be called the Leipzig Werkstatt. It now has a different name, but this is probably the biggest printing museum in the world. They have 500,000 cases of metal type. They have 400 odd printing machines. I used to go there for collotype, but yeah, an amazing museum. But my role, mainly within the European printing museums, was to be the non-letterpress person. Because they were all obsessed with letterpress, and I used to say, yeah, excuse me. So I spent quite a lot of time on, for instance, the history of screen printing. How are we doing for time? The history of screen printing is just not documented. There is actually now a really good book on the history of screen printing by a German, but it hasn't been documented. It's unknown. Photomechanical processes like Woodbury type, we've spent 15 continuous tone negative, so a negative with no dots or halftones. When you shine light through, the gelatine will harden in relation to how much light it's received. You can then wash that gelatine out, and the gelatine will wash away in curves in relation to how much light or how hard or soft it is. If you then take a piece of lead and stick it on top and stick it in a press, you make a lead matrix that goes up and down in various tones. If you fill that with hot liquid gelatine that's got pigment in it, and stick it in a press and flatten it, it all squashes out the side, but you end up with a gelatine print that's thicker and thinner for darks to lights. It's the only truly continuous tone printing process ever invented. It was between 1865 and 1905, and it died out because you have to put it in a press and squash it, and all the bits splatter out, so you have to cut it down and paste it into a book. So it was never going to be a truly commercial process. There are some beautiful books. There's a book called Thompson's Street Life of London, which was printed in 1881, which has these things in, and you pay £100,000 for a copy now. It's so rare, but it's a beautiful process. And actually, the thing about the process was it defies all digital technology because it's just thickness and thinness of the. So that's Woodbury type, and sort of why half of my academic background has been fighting for alternatives in printing. Okay, let's go to the next one. So that's half my other background. The other half of my academic background is I started Impact. There was no academic discipline for printmaking as a practitioner. Now, plenty of art historians, plenty of socio-historic, but as a practitioner, a person who makes art, there was no academic forum. Now, research funding in England relies on your academic forum and be able to publish papers and to write and publish. So we had to create a forum, so hence we created Impact. I'd been going to America for a few years to something called the Southern Graphics Council. that's not the same. In America, whether you have donuts or printmaking, you have to have a conference to meet. You know, donut manufacturers come from all over America to have a conference for a weekend to meet and swap jobs. And so the Southern Graphics printmaking is exactly the same. They all come together over a weekend to actually discuss what's going on and to swap jobs and whatever. So they don't publish anything because they don't need to. So Impact was very much, though based on the same sort of formula as Southern Graphics, because they had lots of exhibitions, they had lots of artists attending, you had show and tell of your open portfolio. Trade shows, and trade shows are very important in printmaking. I have to stress, if you don't buy proper printmaking ink from a proper printmaking manufacturer, they'll go bust and they'll go out of business, and there's only a couple left, but that's a different story. But so we started Impact and we published papers, and that was what it was about, to create an academic discipline for printmaking. It's been very successful, I think. There's now been 12. So this is actually Impact 6. Can we go to the next one? Yeah, so Impact 11 was in Hong Kong, Impact 8 was in Dundee, Impact 3 was in Berlin and Poznan in Poland, Impact 10 was in Santander in Spain. One of the reasons you get to go to nice places is by chairing a conference. I no longer chair it, Karina now chairs it, but I think it's done its job. So, So next one. And I write books. I'm just about to rewrite my book on ink. I've been working on it. 20 years ago when I wrote this was just the beginning of that whole movement of what was called safe printmaking.
Non-toxic.
Non-toxic printmaking. I've never been very happy with those terms, and I've never been very happy with the materials they use. But now life has changed. We're now into environmental concerns, and most of those products are not environmentally sound any longer. So it's time for a rethink. So I'm rewriting my book on ink. I don't think I'll rewrite the water-based screen printing. It had a life of its own. The 3D printing for artists, designers and makers has gone through 2 iterations. I don't know if I've got another iteration in me. So, and very successful. But I have one more major book to write, which is my book about printmaking from my view, which I will write at some point. But yeah, so that's me as an academic. So I think we're going back to the art next. Yeah. So another wings, and just, you know, I'm an artist. I once said to somebody, I'm an artist, I'm not an academic. And it was in the university, and they said, no, sorry mate, you're an academic and you've got to live with it. So I've always found it interesting balance between being an academic and an artist. Really I want to be an artist, but I had to make a living, so I did both. Okay, I think there's one more. Yeah, you were asking about, this is the drawings reduced and made into a print, but I don't think it has the same quality or tactile feel as the brown paper version has.
I think what I really like about your work is, you know, I'm an architect, so really when I see your drawings, you know, there's the attachment to it already, because there's the precision, the technical aspects, but then, but when you put colors into it, when you find wallpaper in your house into it, you put narrative to everything you draw.
Yeah.
So that for me, that defines the artistic part of the work.
Yeah.
It's no longer just, you know, sort of the plan or the section elevations of.
Well, yeah, and there's a real difference. I think I agree with you totally that I don't think this works, whereas the glue and the bits and the shopping list and things on the drawing were a completely different life. But sometimes unless you do this, you don't know that that's going to,
Because I think sometimes we probably drawn to form by itself, the beauty of the form, proportions and stuff, and then you try to work out, you know, the object, which is the kite of the plane in your case. But I think most people hope when they see your work is how do you make it, right? So the drawings, when there's glue and, you know, it shows the process, I think that's the interesting part of the work.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that.
I think, Liz, I understand why you asked that question about scale, because the scheme, it was a schematic.
Yeah.
The way you drew the diagrammatic representation on the craft paper was a schematic that you used to actually build your objects one to one.
Yeah.
You know, I understand you coming from an architecture background, why you find that very intriguing, because I do as well. I'm not an architect.
No, but it's like the drawing, you start with nothing and then how do you come to something?
But you see, I also think that this, I agree with you both entirely, and I think that this is sort of another of those, a piece of work on the way to somewhere else.
Right, yeah.
It definitely didn't work, and I kind of put it in because it didn't work. And there's something wrong with it. So it's a piece on the way to somewhere else. I'll probably just tear it up and then move on to something else. But without having made it, I didn't know the value of the original drawing for me.
Yeah.
I mean, you can probably see
Did
that.
you keep that piece, the craft paper drawing?
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's behind the sofa at the moment.
Okay.
And then my other question would be, have you ever started doing, you know, the drawing of a new plane or kite and then you're like, this probably might not work. And then you put it away and then you revisit it.
Absolutely, constantly. Yeah. Though there are far more drawings that never get revisited. Yeah. I have a whole collection of, my workshop is packed with, you know, lots of brown paper, which is lots of paper I've never printed on. My family say to me they're the only person they know that's got £5,000 or £6,000 worth of unprinted paper, because I collect paper for printing on that I intend to print on. But on the other hand, there's whole stacks of work that most printmakers keep it under the bed. But you know, there's a lot of under the bed stuff that I might never visit again.
I mean, things like these, whether it's this silk screen print or that craft paper thing, sort of fits into the making of kind of category which complements your 3D work.
Yeah.
You know, to make the whole thing complete and more understandable to people who are artists or not. That's my kind of perspective to this debate. So,
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because that's part of the life your work has once it's left you. If you know what I mean, and that's really interesting because I always find the only way I can describe that is I once made a piece with gold leaf all over it, a golden section piece, an old piece, and it went into the Royal Academy Summer Show, which is, and I sold all 20 out of the edition. It was great, and one man came along and said, "I don't like the fact you've signed it on the back because I couldn't sign it on the front because it was gold leaf. Will you sign it with this big, thick felt tip marker?" I can't think. Yeah, right. Because it then had a life which was beyond me. I didn't like doing it, but it was his, not mine anymore. So what do you do? You know? Yeah, it's quite interesting, isn't it? So that's it.
Okay, so you can have the floor. Anybody have any questions, or you want Stephen to sort of explain a bit more on whatever he's talking about?
Do I need that?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Please.
It's quite rare that as an artist, you know, you can balance the academic side and the industry collaboration, and also running a research center. You know, all the writing, you know, all of the kind of more cerebral or more organizational stuff. How do you do that? How do you
That's my question
so
3 days ago, wasn't it?
Up until 5 years ago, I was famous that I would be replying to emails at 2 a.m. I can't do that anymore. I only work 2 days a week now to make the. My wife demands at least 2 or 3 days for the garden and other things. And I write on the train or the aeroplane. This is why I was saying, actually flying here, I only did a couple of hours work, but normally I would write on a plane.
That's
or a
because
train.
you were in business class.
That's because I was in business. Yeah. Folks, it was unbelievably unusual. I got upgraded to business class on my flight. I think it might have just been one of those unbelievably rare occasions when the word professor made a difference. It's usually useless, but That's a difficult one. A good team. And I just love, and if I was truthfully honest, there is a really good answer to that, which is I'm a starter, but I'm not necessarily a good finisher. So I'm good at starting, and my poor team always had to pick things up once I'd started. That would be the brutally honest answer. I've never... it's a really hard question to answer, because I've never thought... I'm a bit of a workaholic. I can't sit still for 5 minutes.
But my guess is you'll always be an artist.
Oh yeah, first and foremost. I have a very good friend who's the artist paper merchant in England, a guy called John Purcell. And he said, I know what retirement for you is going to be. He said, you'll give up work on Friday and then you'll put the printing apron on Monday morning. And that'll be your retirement. He's not far wrong. I'm supposedly retired, and here I am. So that's the answer.
That's a wonderful answer.
Thank you.
But you're juggling between the 3 roles that Keith just mentioned. Which one you enjoy most?
Being an artist.
But do you think, the center with its reputation and status at this moment is to me, it's a huge achievement by an artist. It doesn't, and this is to be truthful and honest, it doesn't feel like that when you're running it. Because you actually only look at the fact... But from here it is.
Yeah, well, I think that's wonderful, but from my perspective, you were talking about deans the other day.
Yeah.
I can now say it because he's gone. I had a dean that said to me, I don't care about your research centre. If we closed it down tomorrow, it was just you, I'd be quite happy.
And that was when?
6 years ago. And we'd been going for nearly 20 years.
Yeah.
And bringing in UK terms, £750,000 a year. That's unheard of. I was the only person for the first 15 years of its existence of the Research Funding Council, the Arts and Humanities Board, that had always had a research grant. So you don't always look at the positives, I suppose. Karina and I always the thing. We always said, and I always said, I sailed my pirate ship, and the pirate ship was going that way, and everybody else could hang on or fall off. You don't think of it like it's what you do. But dividing things up. I still get lots of negative comments. Somebody once said to me, how did I cope with all the knives in my back? And the answer to that is no room for any more, good question. I don't know. You don't think about reputation. Does a famous rock star think about reputation? Probably not. That's an extreme example, but I know certainly, Richard Hamilton and I used to discuss food and wine, We'd work on something and then it would be lunchtime. And that was the most important part of the day.
And dealing with industry is...
Dealing with industry is quite interesting. I told you the story the other day, and I think it is a language thing. I have a very good friend, Michael Crane, who runs Cranfield Ink, who makes artists printmaking ink. And it's very much the right sort of language. Michael once described this thing. He had a salesman in France who went to a hotel, and there was a room with a bath and a room with a shower, and one was 10 euros more than the other. And so the salesman said, what's the difference between the room with the bath and the room with the shower? And the reply was, in the shower you stand up and in the bath you lay down. And perfectly correct. And a lot of what we do with industry is using the right language. So in ink terms, artists talk about a buttery ink, a short ink, a heavy ink. Those terms don't mean anything that's viscosity, tack, length, other terms for industry. So you just...
But the fact is, most artists don't have the scientific background to these terms.
Well, not
I mean, in Hong Kong.
I learnt them.
Okay. You adjust yourself to that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how you describe that. Sorry, it's,
Yeah.
I'm not being disingenuous. I think it's just, it's back to this thing that if I was going to survive and be comfortable and have a career doing what I wanted to do, then I had to learn how to do those things, I think. Somebody once said to me, for a long time, I was 38 before I had a proper job, you know, as an academic, whatever. I used to teach in 5 different art schools on 5 different days, all of that. And somebody once said to me, but you don't play the game. You know, there's no point running against a brick wall, play the game. And I suppose that's what I did. I learned the language and learned how to. My father always said there's an English expression, gift of the gab, you know, took the hind leg off a donkey. Yeah, I can. My team at UE always used to say they'd turn me on, stand me up in front like this, let me go, and the difficult bit was turning me off. Yeah, I think confidence, which I don't feel I have, but that's an outward thing, isn't it?
Were you at any time at risk, whether your artist life or your
no, that's an
academic?
interesting one. There is an answer to that. For a few years, I ran my own studio. I had a pseudonym in the 80s. I was known as Steve Kevin. An anagram of Steve Hoskins was Kevin Hostess. And I made big triptych screen prints of blended mountains. I was made a lot of money in the 80s for a short period, well, what I thought was a lot of money. And I ran a studio and I did well. And then the pound crashed against the dollar. And it went overnight, and I had to find something else to do. So everything was on the line. I started teaching and doing that. The good thing about running a research department wasn't my money. So I could, oh yeah, let's do that. I could apply for a grant, which is miraculous. We could do that, and if it all went wrong, I didn't lose my house. The university would just say, naughty boy. And they never did, you know, it usually worked. But it meant I could gamble in a way.
Using other people's money?
Yeah, of course. And isn't that what research is?
Okay.
I mean, in one sense, I mean, maybe that isn't very good. But it, but in one sense, that's true. I mean, you know, the government, you know, applying for a research grant is you're up against 50 other people. It depends on how you write it. You've got to get in the top 5, and having sat on the other side of the fence and given away research grants, then 60% are in the bin immediately. They're just not good enough. 40% are okay. 10% are going to make it anyway, and then you might give it to the others. So, you know, it's that thing of the money's there, and if you write it well enough, they have to give it out. They have to give the money out. So it was going to go to me, you know, of course. And then I could do these things. But you have to deliver, and that's the most important thing. 2 things. Our research centre relied on the fact we made stuff. We made things, hippos, bowls. You know, most scientific research is lab-based research. They prove a concept, but they don't make an artifact.
In journals only?
They write it up in a journal, and we make stuff, artifacts. So, oh yeah, I can do that. Look, here's a hippo. Or I can do that. Here's a bowl. So that's one big advantage.
But your centre's approach is quite different from other arts and humanities.
Absolutely.
You know, researchers.
Yes.
Yeah, because you bring in technology and you bring in the scientific part and industry collaboration, which is quite rare for artistic kind of endeavors.
Yeah, but that comes back to my thing is I didn't want to be a poor artist.
Yeah, right.
I mean, you know, I can do all this stuff and people will give me money, so why wouldn't I do it?
Right.
I mean, it is the simple answer to your earlier question, I think. you know.
Was there ever a time when you had sort of like a resistance to these things, and then was there an event that helped you kind of open up to these possibilities? A lot of artists, they are resistant to
turn things away,
especially you know, when it comes to technology or money even, or you know, corporate sponsorship and things like that.
I think there were two things. When I first started teaching in universities at the end of the 70s and the early 1980s, a lot of people turned around to me and said, "Oh, you're just a technician, you don't make real art because you're not conceptual." Which hurt, but I was good at that technical stuff, so I held on to it. I think that's one of the good reasons. The other is, why not? You know, just as much, you know, it's that philosophy, I think, that the government wasn't going to give me money if I wasn't going to benefit industry. So why not benefit industry and then spend a third of my time making art? You know, that's kind of a, you know, yeah, sorry, you asked a question.
Hi, my question is about you shared the project with the Egyptian studies.
Yeah.
It sounds a very interesting project, and I want to ask what happened to that printed organ afterwards. And can I take it as you were getting into the field of archaeology or and you're crossing disciplines so much?
No, it's quite the opposite. I'll give you an answer in two ways. The first research application I made to do Egyptian faience, I explained about Egyptian faience. I cited a number of archaeologists because you have to cite the academic in your application. So I cited a number of prominent archaeologists who had worked in the field, but my application was about 3D printing Egyptian faience. That was what I wanted to do. It got turned down because there wasn't enough archaeology in it. And yet it was nothing to do, it was citing the archaeology, but it wasn't anything to do with the archaeology. So I rewrote it. It took me another 2 years to get the money. And I rewrote it and I got rid of all the archaeology and said, we are just doing this 3D printed Egyptian faience process. And then I got the money, okay? But
You approached yourself, but not they found you.
sorry?
You approached them yourself, but not they found you or invited you to like being part of this.
No, it's entirely my academic partner Dave Hewson and I. It was a logical progression. We'd held our patents for 3D printed ceramics, so it was a logical progression to look at Egyptian self-glazing ceramics. Actually, Dave, who comes from industry, didn't want to do it. He said, well, what's the point? We'll never be able to sell it to anybody. It's never the same. It's always different. And I said, it's a good bit of research. So that's what it is. So that's what we did. The archaeologists, I mean, the Met people loved it. And you know, we did have this long discussion about doing amulets. And I talked a lot to the British Museum. We work a lot anyway, the British Museum, National Gallery. You know, over the years, we've worked with the major institutions. But fundamentally, it's difficult to describe, but it was about a bit of research, because though we work with industry, most of our research is about a process, and you make an artifact, and it's a piece of pure applied research. Difficult terms there, because what a scientist will call pure research isn't necessarily what I do. I do what's called applied research. And that's quite difficult. But yeah, and then it's the application of my research, which then comes afterwards. I mean, certainly, you know, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, who funded me, made a little video of our 3D printed ceramics. Most of their videos have 100 viewers on YouTube. The 3D printed ceramics has had just under 500,000 views. So, you know, they like me and we like them because we deliver. It's part of the, and that sounds arrogant, it's not meant to, it's just what we do, you know. Yeah.
Stephen.
Oh, yes, please.
My interest
It's quite hot.
Yeah.
is, you know, you have this part where you researching on new technology, on printing, etc. But your artistic work is actually getting your hands dirty.
Yeah.
Using the most basic pencil hands. So I wonder, do you actually have to be like turning off part of your brain, knowing all
No.
this new technology going in, or actually they inspire you?
No, the opposite. I also am full of sayings and aphorisms, and one of them is we do a lot of looking back to go forward. And it's that new technology to me is another tool in the box. That's all it is. It's another tool in the box, a different way of drawing, a different way of thinking, a different way of seeing. But it, in itself, it doesn't do anything. So, no, I don't put a different hat on. They're just parts of the same hat, I think.
Have you ever thought of have you ever tried 3D printing any of your planes or kites?
No.
That's an intentional...
That's not true. Yeah, well, I had a discussion with Cranfield University, a big aerospace university in England, and they print 3D print steel and titanium. And
Steel and titanium.
yeah.
3D print.
3D print, and they print titanium. We're not talking small. We're talking 30 feet and
Vehicles.
seriously bits of aeroplane. And we were having a discussion at one point that we'd 3D print the gull wings in titanium. It didn't happen in the end because a lot of these things you start and then they don't happen. You know, I mean, I reckon 1 in 10 projects happens. That's the only time I've really thought. I've 3D printed parts. I did a collaborative project with a photographer called Desire Lines, where we made some 3-meter kites, and we 3D printed all the connection parts and pieces because it was a useful tool. But I don't like the aesthetics of most of what's 3D printed, which is why we went into ceramics, because the aesthetics of 3D printed ceramics are pretty good. It looks and feels right. It's a bit light in weight. But yeah, the aesthetics aren't there yet, I think is what I'd say about most 3D printed stuff.
When you talk about aesthetics, do you mean the drawing programs are not? You cannot.
No, wrong thing. The aesthetics of the material qualities would be what I mean. The actual, yeah, most 3D printed artifacts, apart from titanium or gold, in printing gold, 3D printing gold, just don't have the right look and feel. So
Because of the resolution?
Yeah, no, the resolution's got good over the last few years. It's mainly, most of them are plastic materials that aren't very appealing. And I can't be bothered to finish them and clean them, and when I can screen print a piece of plywood and laser cut it. Yeah, difficult, isn't it? I've always kept part of my artwork to one side from the research for the serendipitous nature and the look and the feel. So I think you're right in one sense that do I turn my head on and off? Not consciously, but yeah, I probably do.
I'm also learning about 3D printing, but there's, in the back of my mind, there's a slight fear about how things can be very cookie cutting and etc., which can also be an advantage for kit parts. But the thinking process, I wonder if you try to bring in the thinking process you do as an artist, because it's very process driven, into the research.
The research is always informed by my background as an artist. There's no doubt that's to do with my understanding of materials and what we call tacit knowledge. There's no doubt. I constantly refer to a book called The Wheelwright Shop, written by somebody called Sturt in the 1930s, which was about the transition from hand building a wooden cart to mechanization, and everything that Sturt talks about of mechanization we now perceive as hand tools and not new technology. So I think the analogy is that we're in that transitional period that Sturt talked about, from hand tools to new technology, but actually we don't use hand tools anymore, in the sense, I don't know a cabinet maker who doesn't use a circular saw and power tools and still think that they're using hand tools. A cabinet maker isn't going to use a hand saw to saw. Some very particular people do, but in the main, a cabinet maker will use all those mechanized tools. So I think we're in that transition phase, and to me 3D printing is still transitional. We've slightly moved out. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would have said everything that's made in art looks like it's 3D printed. That's no longer the case. And there are particular examples. There are two fabulous jewelers who a long time ago did this wonderful thing. They liked the naffness and the mistakes of 3D printing. So they took a series of people and dressed them up with paper decorations to look like American Indians or naval officers or soldiers, and then scanned them badly with the 3D technology at the time, and then printed them with the bad 3D technology, and they looked like 3D printed soldiers or Red Indians or whatever, which they weren't, because it was all paper that made it. That to me was a really interesting use of the technology at the time. But we've moved on from there, and beginning, I think, to be in the area of transition between where 3D printing is just becoming more useful. I certainly know all our technical guys in the workshop at the moment, they'll just 3D print things as an art. Oh, I need a bit to do this, or I'll 3D print it. Or I need a bit to do that, and they'll 3D print it, and then they'll assemble it all together and laser cut another bit and stick it together. So we're in that transitional phase, I think. And it's not a new technology. I mean, there's a great video from 1986 from Charles, oh God, I can't think of his name now, the inventor of the first 3D printer, that says this is the new coming technology, and the quality of what he was demonstrating in 1986 didn't change until about 2016. So it's been around a while. Chuck Hull was the inventor of 3D printing, had the first patents, and he filed his first patent in 1976. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. I could talk to you about 3D printing for hours.
And questions from the floor? I mean, students? Ocean? Anything you would ask? Jay? We still have something like 5 minutes max. I have a question.
Okay.
Very seldom artists have patterns on the shoulders. Is that how does it come by for in your case?
because I think a lot of academic writing is over lengthy and often written for, to be brutal, often written for self-gratification rather than to convey something. And that's being brutal, but I think it's better to try and convey things simply if you can. And simple isn't simplistic, which is something I've always thought about.
That's what I see so far. You're actually not just cross-discipline. It's consciously or subconsciously you're breaking all the boundaries and trying to supposedly they're in separate form or separate industry, whatever that term. You're merging them together and then somehow breaking stereotypes on how people see those what is art. Like print, supposedly you don't need to put craftsmanship together.
Yeah, absolutely, and very consciously. I very consciously try and break the barriers. There are problems to that. One of our biggest problems is if I put a research application into an arts research council, it'll often get turned down because it's too science-based. But if I put it into a science research council, it'll often be turned down for being too arts-based, when actually it's properly interdisciplinary. And actually, academics are very bad at interdisciplinary. They don't get that there are really interesting things between the borders of academic disciplines. And I don't see why there should be borders between academic disciplines. Even when I was a student at the Royal College of Art, I was quite proud that I worked in every department but film and television and fashion. Otherwise, I managed to work in every other department. So, yeah, I just don't see... I get quite a lot of flack for not seeing, especially from artists and designers, that not seeing that there are barriers, but there shouldn't be. We don't need barriers, they're artificial. That's my view.
Thanks a lot, Stephen. Last question for me. You've been in Hong Kong for a week, just a little bit more than a week. What is your impression of Hong Kong and us? Puppets one.
I've had a fabulous time here. I've really enjoyed myself. Yeah, I love Hong Kong. I'm not sure I could live here, but I think it's a fab place to be. And at the print workshop is, as I said really earlier this afternoon, that I think you're very unusual too as a print workshop. I've not come across a print workshop that maintains the number of staff and the community outlook that you have. Most print workshops are self-centered, as most artists are. And what I love, and I think the common ground between us, is it's not about yourselves, it's about the community that you serve. And I think that's really important.
That's quite soothing then, to end a talk like this. Thank you very much, Professor Hoskins, and thank you very much for coming in today. I hope you learned a lot. I do. Thanks.